In just 5 days, Ukraine has recaptured more than 200 square kilometers of territory from Russia, marking their biggest battlefield gains in 2.5 years. Now, I don't want to shock anyone, but it looks like the theme these days is Russia exaggerating success at the front and then Ukraine proving them wrong. Now, starting out with a Russian assessment here from Rybar, they say, quote, "The situation in western Zaporizhzhia has sharply complicated over the past day. Ukrainian formations have launched an offensive on a sector approximately 20 kilometers wide." Now, turning to Deep State Map here to show you the area we're talking about today, in recent videos, we've talked about the Ukrainian counterattacks in this area here, kind of to the northeast in the Zaporizhzhia direction. Rybar's talking about a whole different area. In fact, they're looking at this sector here, right along the Dnipro. So we have multiple areas in the last couple days that Ukraine has kicked off a degree of counterattacks. Rybar says recent reports about the liberation of Maldanivka proved false. The situation in Primorsky has significantly worsened. The northern part of the settlement remains a layered zone with mixed positions. Previously, the liberation of Rykny was claimed, but the current dynamics suggest the settlement was not under stable Russian control. Likely, only small groups entered at best. So looking at the map here, the areas he's talking about, Rykny up here, he says that was not actually under Russian control. Maldanivka here, turns out the report of that being taken was false. And Primorsky, also claimed by Russia 2 days ago. This is where it gets wild. And at what point do we just have to brush aside all of the Russian claims? Because I'll put it on the screen here. The Russian Ministry of Defense on February 15th said they have captured Zaporizhzhia, Maldanivka, and Primorsky in the Zaporizhzhia directions. They claimed ownership of those territories. They took them. 24 hours later, Rybar is coming back saying, actually, probably not. These are territories taken on credit. It's happened now in multiple areas in the Zaporizhzhia front. We also have some updates on how that played out in Kupiansk and even reports that it's happening in Chasiv Yar. This is the Russian theme as of late, and Ukraine is doing their best to take advantage of this and recapture territory when they can. Now, looking at the map here, again, the Russian assessment of what's playing out on this front, they say, Rybar, the enemy advanced along the E-105 highway. This is the stretch of road running south between Primorsky and Stepnorisk, deployed assault troops in Plavny, here in the middle of the map. As a result, Russian units in Primorsky were cut off from main positions. In Stepnorisk itself, the enemy not only held positions in the north of the city, but also managed to increase their presence. And they added that Ukraine has been carrying out strikes across some of these river crossings down here. I believe this one just north of Vasilivka took place yesterday. So it does look like Ukraine is starting to isolate this battlefield and make the Russian forces that are in, whether it's Kupiansk or Plavny or even up north in Primorsky, cut them off from Russia's ability to resupply them. This is very, very similar to what we saw play out and still playing out in Kupiansk. Sever the lines of communication so Russia cannot reinforce or retreat, and then subsequently push through assault units, eliminating those Russian forces. Rybar continued by saying how many forces the enemy has accumulated in these liberated villages is a question that will almost certainly remain unanswered. Now, from the Ukrainian side, we are starting to get a little bit of information about what's actually playing out here. Again, I want to stress that when I say Zaporizhzhia, there are two different directions, the west and the east, where we are seeing confirmation from the Russian side that Ukraine is going on the attack. General Syrsky, the top Ukrainian commander, said, "Our units are conducting effective counterattacks and assault operations," adding that he emphasized the top priority is liberating territories, but we must first of all preserve the lives of our soldiers and maintain the combat readiness of units and subunits. That's a little bit in contrast to what we've been hearing from the Ukrainian Defense Minister Fedorov as of late, who seems to be prioritizing the elimination of Russian soldiers. You'll recall in recent weeks, he's really stressed the number of 50,000. 50,000 Russian soldiers killed or seriously wounded every single month. So it is a little bit interesting to hear the top military commander, Syrsky, here talking about the top priority being the liberation of territories. Now, sticking with the Ukrainian assessments of these counterattacks, Bakhmut Demon, so a Ukrainian soldier constantly posting updates from the front, said it's very tense on the Zaporizhzhia front. And this is the first time since the start of the large-scale war that the enemy is throwing everything they have at the attacks. The scumbags are rushing forward and trying to consolidate their position, filling the settlements with scumbags and abandoning and occupying abandoned houses and destroyed villages. It's very difficult there, and it will get even harder in the spring and summer. The war will continue. We need to defend our country, and we will be fighting all year long. That's my feeling. But he says on the positive side, we've made progress on 2 fronts, and our forces are advancing. For now, I'll refrain from specifying the exact front lines. The situation is like a stalemate. We're here, they're there, and the fighting tactically accordingly. Now, in terms of the overall change of territorial control, AFP reported, quote, Ukraine recaptured 201 square kilometers from Russia between Wednesday and Sunday last week, taking advantage of a Starlink shutdown for Russian forces. That's according to an AFP analysis of data from the Institute for the Study of War. They say the recaptured area is almost equivalent to the Russian gains for the entire month of December and is the most land retaken by Kyiv's forces in such a short period of time since a June 2023 counteroffensive. Now, something we've talked about in recent videos is this gray zone here. So trying to track the exact location of the front lines is impossible. I'm not going to say challenging anymore. It is impossible. It doesn't exist. And we've had multiple analysts, multiple experts, to include soldiers in both Russia and Ukraine, talk about this gray zone dynamic, gray zone, kill zone. And in this area, so we'll zoom into the Dobropillia area here, Dobropillia in the Zaporizhzhia direction, again, another area with multiple names. It is not accurate to look at this and say Russian forces are dug in, say, along this line, and then you've got Ukrainian forces here in the green area. A better assessment is that all throughout this gray zone, there are multiple Russian and multiple Ukrainian positions. And this is the kind of counterattack system that we've seen Ukraine carry out in the other Dobropillia north of Pokrovsk, now in Zaporizhzhia, and also in Kupiansk, where they deliberately clear through some of these gray zones, recognizing that in some areas are Ukrainian forces, and they can kind of get to them and resupply them and help evacuate them. And in other locations, they identify Russian forces and systematically clear those out. In fact, when looking at this, a lot of what comes to mind is what played out in Kupiansk at the end of 2025, still playing out right now. Interestingly, I've had a few people comment recently, like, wait, we used to hear a lot about Kupiansk, and now we aren't. What's actually going on that front? So we do have some updates from the Kupiansk sector, but first a quick update here on a fundraiser that we're about to wrap up. We're at about 86,000 euros of a 97,000 euro goal. We're working with Cars for Ukraine, incredible organization. I was fortunate to be able to hand off a couple vehicles that we fundraised at the end of last year when I was in Ukraine, right at the start of this year. And the reason that Car for Ukraine is doing such important work is a lot of the vehicles that the soldiers either purchase themselves or are donated through fundraisers, whatever it might be, they get the first one they can, right? Vehicles are so important that once they get to $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, they buy what they can so they can get it put to use. But a lot of times that comes with a lot of unnoticed repairs, or even people being sketchy and trying to sell soldiers stuff for more than it's worth. So then the soldiers get ready to drive this out to the front to evacuate wounded, maybe, or resupply soldiers in a difficult position, and it breaks down. And they may not even get a single mission out of it. Think about that. How awful is that? So Car for Ukraine is the polar opposite. These guys, they source quality vehicles from across Europe. They've done over 800 deliveries at this point, an insane number. And they make sure the vehicles are fully serviced. They have winter tires, added armor protection, ready to go. So when the cars that we're sourcing, in this case, for the 104th Territorial Defense Brigade, they show up to the soldiers ready to roll. Of course, we're actually starting our work now on the next patch. So if you want to get this patch, for the winter offensive that we just kicked off, we're only going to be running this patch, I believe, through the end of this campaign, and then we'll come up with a second one for the next. But for those interested and able, the link to contribute will be in the description below. Now, continuing on with some updates in the northeast around Kupiansk, this is one where we I would say it's the second area where we really saw this Ukrainian tactic of, after the Russian forces infiltrate through their lines, they plan a deliberate clearance operation, heavily resourced with a lot of assets on hand to systematically clear the Russians out. And the OPSEC involved in this has been impressive as well. So we know the Kupiansk operation was largely kept quiet while it was playing out. And we did start to get a couple updates from both the Ukrainian and Russian side here recently, along with some new footage out of Kupiansk. Euromaidan reports, quote, Ukraine's defense forces have established firm control over Kupiansk, with only a few dozen Russian occupiers remaining trapped inside a single city block. That's according to Viktor Trehubov, the spokesperson for Ukraine's joint forces. They say the surrounded Russians survive on airdrop supplies and are unable to carry out any active operations, while enemy attempts to attack the city from the outside continue to fail. They say Ukrainian forces detected 22 Russian radio call signs in Kupiansk on February 15th. They say the actual number of occupiers is somewhat higher, but remains in the range of a few dozen, all of them concentrated in one specific quarter of tall buildings north of the city center in a hospital area. They say the remaining Russians have dug in across several high-rises and are attempting to hold a defensive perimeter. However, they lack the capacity for any offensive action. Their only lifeline is airdropped food and ammunition. And as we've seen in other areas, when these Russian forces are able to infiltrate and get through Ukrainian lines, they end up in many cases being cut off. Russia is often using FPV-style drones. They just have a lot of them. And they're using these one-way attack drones, but instead of a warhead, it has water bottles or warm clothing or food, ammunition, batteries, etc. And they're flying those either into the Russian position or at a drop point where the Russian soldiers can go then and collect those goods. So looking at the map here on Deep State, this generally tracks with most of the assessments we're getting from the Russian and the Ukrainian side, where Russian forces are isolated in a relatively small area to the northern portion of the city. Now, the Russian assessments have really slowed down in the Kupiansk direction as of late. You'll recall a couple months ago, they started talking about having taken, let me zoom out a little bit here. They it was out of nowhere. They said they had taken Kupyansk, Vuzlovi, all the way down here, just completely detached from reality, right? So there's no evidence that that happened, no evidence that that was even close. That's kind of the degree of Russian reports. We're getting a bit of panic in some of these directions as their false reporting is coming to light. Two majors, a Russian analyst here, the only thing he added to this was, quote, "In Kupiansk, the enemy is concentrating its efforts on attacks on our positions. Battles are ongoing." Now, I have no doubt that there are still some Russian forces in Kupiansk. I would not be surprised at this point if you have seen a redeployment of Ukrainian forces from that sector to other areas. Just the mopping up there has become a much smaller task than it was 1, 2, certainly 3 months ago. Now, this Russian theme over the course of the last 4, 5, 6 months has really come into light where, for lack of a better term, they are just lying about progress in the battlefield. Now, you can assign blame wherever you want. I would argue that it kind of starts at the bottom and ends at the top. Like, everyone needs to be held to account for this. Somebody needs to poke their head in there and say, this clearly does not line up with reality. And we are seeing those reports from the soldiers. I mean, regular reports from Russian mill bloggers are talking about how frustrated the soldiers are that they see these reports coming from the Russian Ministry of Defense, and they're like, what are they talking about? And who are you trying to confuse? There are Ukrainian soldiers in the village right now that you say is under Russian control. So what is the point of making that up? But whatever logic, whatever reason you assign to that, personally, I think a part of that is trying to appeal to a Western audience. As negotiations are ongoing, Russia wants to continue the narrative, and you'll see it on social media. You'll no doubt see it in the comment section here. The people saying Russia just continues to advance. Who cares about the losses? Who cares about the pace? Russia just continues to advance. What if some of those advances are made up? That's kind of what Ukraine is showing right now. Again, Kupiansk, now in Zaporizhzhia, and we just got reports a couple days ago starting to come together that may have actually played out in Chasiv Yar as well. Let me go back to the map here to show you the area we're talking about. Remember a couple of years ago, Bakhmut, the nasty meat-grinding fight that was Bakhmut? Chasiv Yar is just here a few kilometers to the west. So Chasiv Yar, the battle for this area began back in April of 2024. So we're coming up on 2 years ago when the battle for Chasiv Yar began. And when we zoom in here, now this is deep state map, and people will say this is biased to the Ukrainian side, so don't count it or don't use it, whatever it is. Personally, I think deep state has proven to be more reliable in recent days, recent months even, especially with this gray zone mapping than anything else. But we will go to a more pro-Russian source here, one that relies more on the Russian assessments. So we'll go to Syriac map. I'll have both of these in the description below if you want to check those out. But even if we go with Syriac and move into Chasiv Yar, again, the battle for this town began almost 2 years ago, and you can see that at least right on the outskirts, it's still being contested. Now, Rybar just put out a note a couple days ago saying the Konstantinivka direction, which again, Rybar or Chasiv Yar overlooking the northern approach to Konstantinivka, he says this area remains one of the most difficult, and one of the reasons are the false reports about the situation, including those made many months ago. This can be seen in the example of Chasiv Yar. The false examples he's giving, and I'm going to put these up on the screen because it's hard to believe at this point how just egregious some of these claims have been. Back on July 31st, 2025, the Russian Ministry of Defense celebrated the liberation of Chasiv Yar. It's still not liberated today. And maybe a good sign should have been 1 month later in August of 2025, when once again, like it didn't happen a month prior, Russia again announced the liberation of Chasiv Yar. Like, what? At that point, maybe there should have been some questions of, what were you talking about a month ago? If now it is, are you sure? Something sounds off here, but here we are, 5-6 months even after that. And according to Rybar, quote, recently it was possible to clarify the situation on the western outskirts of the city, where conflicting reports have been coming in for some time. It turned out that the armed forces of Ukraine maintain a presence in the western part and are even attacking towards the city center. All of this hinders the advance inside Konstantinivka itself. Nevertheless, they say there is a silver lining. Russian troops are gradually approaching the southwestern outskirts of the city from the side of Yablivka. Zoom out here so you can see the area they're talking about. They're saying, don't worry about Chasiv Yar. There are attacks coming from the south. They say it's quite possible that in Konstantinivka, the armed forces of Ukraine will soon be forced to stretch their forces over several defense sectors at once. This is like a plague for the Russian military at this point, right? It seems like everywhere that gets more attention, we find out, wait a minute, those reports were fabricated. Again, July and August 2025, this territory was completely taken. 6 months later, wait a minute, not only not fully taken, still contested to a degree with Ukrainian forces in the western portion of the city. Now, that is a theme across the front, and it makes you question how much of these Russian gains that, again, are being celebrated by the Russian Ministry of Defense and Russian war bloggers, by and large, and their supporters in the West, saying, look at the incredible progress that Russia is making. It does make you question how much of that is genuine, how much of that is an individual Russian soldier that gets drone struck once he makes it 10 kilometers behind Ukrainian lines. But I don't want to present that as though everything is moving along smoothly for Ukraine across the front. Sticking in this area, Konstantinivka is under real pressure. So turning to analyst Plyfra here, who will be linked in the description below, he says Russian forces continue attacking Ilanivka and Berestov along the marked routes in waves of small groups. Most get destroyed, but some Russians are able to survive up to their objective. So he's talking about the advance here in the southern portion of Konstantinivka. And when we zoom out a little bit, this is the pocket in the east that has become a significant kill zone for Ukraine. They are inflicting massive casualties on the Russian forces trying to take the rest of Donetsk. This is the area right now as negotiations are ongoing in Geneva, I believe it is. Losing track because they're happening all over the place, and they all kind of result in the same thing. Excuse my pessimism. But one of the things that's going to be brought up in that is Russia wants the rest of Donetsk. That would be giving up this area and this defensive belt. Chasiv Yar, that again was taken 6 months ago, but somehow still not taken. Of course, Ukraine doesn't want to give that up. Konstantinivka is one of the kind of the nearest city, or nearest big town is probably a better way to put it, to the current Russian advancing forces there. They say the effects of last week's heavy fog are still being felt. Ukrainian clearing groups are still working in the southwestern portion of the city. There are some Russian casualties and prisoners. But he says the most pressing issue right now is for the Ukrainians, logistics and Russian drones. The activity is extremely high, Russian drones, and the only way to resupply positions right now is with UGVs, unmanned ground vehicles, or 10 kilometers of walking, which takes hours, and it's necessary to constantly stop to take shelter. We've seen this play out in other areas. It's a little bit concerning from the Ukrainian side that this is already resorting to UGV-only resupply. When you're talking about just up the road, you run into Drushivka, Kramatorsk, and then Sloviansk. So this is the hub of Ukrainian defense in this area. We talked in recent videos the challenges of moving supplies from Izium down to Sloviansk with some longer-range Russian drones. If they are now, but there are still vehicles, like manned vehicles making that drive, all day, every single day. If we're talking about mostly UGVs, robots getting supplies into Konstantinivka and wounded soldiers out, that paints this area in a pretty difficult situation. They say in the case of heavy fog, it is possible to take a risk and ride a vehicle into the city to resupply it. In conclusion, the city holds the defense quite tightly, even in conditions of fog, but this will not happen indefinitely. And the more pressure is applied on the logistics, the less effective the Ukrainian defense will be in this direction, and the more holes will appear in their lines. So again, some interesting themes that we've seen play out in recent months. Like by and large, yes, Russia is advancing. Technically, Russia is advancing. They are taking more territory than they are losing. I mean, even if you look at the if you look at the last few weeks here, it looks like Ukraine was able to wipe out a lot of those gains. But the theme throughout this war has been a slow, steady Russian advance. That is continuing. What's notable in recent months is that we have seen a spike in what appears to be casualties inflicted by Ukrainian forces. Remember, December and January are some of the highest casualty-producing months for the Russian military since the war began. Like 35,000 killed or seriously wounded. Those numbers are going up. At the same time, we are seeing a significant uptick in false Russian reporting. Read into that however you want. I think there's a couple different directions you can take it. It'll be interesting to see if that is addressed. Right? We can tell Kupiansk was such a glaring example of over-exaggerated claims that Ukraine was able to take advantage of. Didn't see many changes in the Russian Ministry of Defense. They said they were announcing an investigation. Nothing came from that. In fact, the commander that announced that Kupiansk had been taken received awards for his work. So, I would say that issue hasn't really been addressed. We're now seeing it play out again on a relatively large scale in Zaporizhzhia. Does Russia actually address this and maybe start to button up their reporting? Can they? Or is this more of a systemic issue that really, and this is where I kind of fall on this issue, I think this is a major problem throughout the Russian military that presents the front line in a very different situation than it actually is and affects how Putin and his senior leadership view the status of the war. I don't think they have a realistic view of how the fight is playing out day in and day out, which will be interesting to see how that plays in to the ongoing negotiations that are happening right now. But that's all we got for now. Again, for those interested and able, the link to contribute to our ongoing fundraiser through Car for Ukraine will be in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.